I wasn't the kind of man who made scenes. Never had been. 41 years of climbing into crawl spaces, running wire through walls that weren't mine, driving home with hands that smelled like copper and sweat. That kind of life doesn't leave much room for drama. You do the work. You keep quiet. You go home. So when my son stepped outside the doors of Harrington's and looked at me the way he did, the way you'd look at a stranger who'd wandered into the wrong neighborhood, I didn't say a word. I just nodded. And I turned around and walked back to my truck. That part came later. Let me start where it actually started. My wife, Carol, died on a Tuesday in October. My son was 11 years old. He'd come home from school to find me sitting at the kitchen table with the phone still in my hand, and he'd understood before I said anything. Kids that age always understand before you want them to. He sat down across from me and we stayed there until it got dark, and neither of us cried, which I've always thought was strange. But grief does strange things to people. I raised him after that. Just the two of us in a house in Dayton that needed more work than I ever had time to give it. I was an electrician, not the kind with a big truck and a crew, just me, my tools, and whatever jobs I could get. Commercial work during the week, residential on weekends. My son did his homework at the kitchen table while I ate dinner standing at the counter because I was usually too tired to sit down properly. I want to be careful about how I say this next part because I don't want it to sound like I'm keeping score. I'm not. When you love someone, you don't keep score. But I need you to understand what I gave so you understand what came later. I worked every overtime hour available for 6 years so my son could go to a decent college. Not a state school on partial scholarship, a real school. The kind with old brick buildings and a name that opens doors. He wanted to study law. I told him to study whatever he wanted. Tuition, room and board, books, I covered it all. I sold Carol's car the summer before his freshman year. I never replaced it. I drove a truck with a cracked dashboard and a heater that only worked on one side for the next decade. He graduated near the top of his class, went to work at a firm in Cincinnati, then another one in Columbus, then a bigger one in Cleveland. Every move up meant a better address and a different version of himself. I was proud of him. I am still proud of him. That part hasn't changed. What changed was when he married my daughter-in-law. I want to be fair. She's smart. She's organized. She came from a family with money and the kind of confidence that money buys. And she wasn't cruel to me at first, she was just precise. Every word she said to me was measured. Every invitation had conditions attached that weren't stated out loud. She called me by my first name immediately, which sounds like a small thing, but it never felt like warmth. It felt like she was reminding me that I hadn't earned anything more formal. The first Christmas after they married, I showed up with a bottle of wine I'd asked the man at the liquor store to help me pick out. She thanked me, set it on the counter, and moved it to the recycling bin before I left. I saw her do it. She didn't know I saw her. I didn't say anything. My son noticed, I think. He looked at the counter and then at me, and I gave him a small shrug, and we moved on. That was the first time I understood that moving on was going to be the thing we did in this family. Move on. Don't make it a thing. Smooth it over. Years passed. They had a son, my grandson. He was the best thing that happened to either side of that family, and from the moment he was born, we understood each other. He had Carol's eyes. He'd sit with me in the garage when he was small, handing me tools he couldn't name yet, asking questions about how things worked. As he got older, we'd talk for hours on the phone about school, about girls, about the kind of decisions young men have to make that nobody prepares you for. My daughter-in-law tolerated our closeness, I think, because my grandson wanted it. He was the only one in that household who ever pushed back on her. I helped my son and his wife buy their house. They needed a larger down payment than they had, and I had equity in my home in Dayton that I'd built up over 30 years. I refinanced, gave them $60,000. No paperwork, no expectation of repayment, just a father doing what fathers do. I also co-signed the business loan when my son left the firm and started his own practice. His credit was good, but not quite good enough at the time. My name on that document was what made it happen. My daughter-in-law knew all of this. She knew exactly what my contributions had made possible. She just preferred not to discuss it. The anniversary party was her idea. 20 years of marriage, and she wanted to do it properly rented event space at Harrington's, a restaurant in their neighborhood that charged $40 for a glass of wine. She'd been planning it for months. I knew about it because my grandson had called me, excited, saying he wanted me there. He'd even told me which table he wanted us to sit at together. I called my son 2 weeks before to ask about the details. What time, where to park, whether the dress code was formal. There was a pause on the phone that went on a little too long. "Dad," he said, "I think it might be better if you didn't come to this one." I asked him what he meant. He said it was going to be mostly her family, their friends from the firm, people from the neighborhood. He said it in the careful voice he used when he was explaining something he didn't believe himself. He said he was worried I might feel out of place, that it would be a long night and I'd have to drive. I asked him if his wife had suggested this. Another pause. "It's just a thought," he said. "We can do something with you separately. Dinner. Just the three of us." I told him I understood. I hung up and sat with the phone in my hand for a while, looking at Carol's photo on the mantel. She was smiling in that picture. The way she smiled when she thought something was funny but was too polite to laugh. I thought about what she would have said about all of this. Probably something dry and quiet and exactly right. I decided to go anyway, not to make a scene, not to embarrass anyone. My grandson had asked me to be there. That was enough. I drove up the night before so I wouldn't be rushed. Got a room at a Holiday Inn 7 minutes from the restaurant. Pressed the shirt I'd brought, the good one I wore to funerals and the occasional graduation. I was not going to be the problem. I was going to sit at my grandson's table, shake hands with people I didn't know, and be the kind of quiet, decent presence that nobody would remember, except the people who mattered. I arrived 10 minutes early. The restaurant had a small lobby with low lighting and the kind of music that's designed to make you feel like you're spending money correctly. My grandson wasn't in the lobby yet. I stood near the entrance and checked my phone. My son came through the inner doors before I'd had a chance to text anyone. He stopped when he saw me. I watched something move across his face. Surprise, then calculation, then something harder. He walked over and took my arm gently, the way you do when you're guiding someone out of a room, and he walked me back toward the entrance doors. Outside, into the cold November air. "Dad," he said. I looked at him. "You can't do this," he said. "I asked you not to come." I told him his grandson had asked me to come. "He's 19, my son said. "He doesn't understand how these things work." I asked him how these things work. He looked away for a moment, toward the parking lot. When he looked back, his voice was lower, more controlled. "You always do this," he said. "Every time there's something important, something just goes sideways. And I can't have that tonight. Not in front of her family. Not in front of these people." He paused. "I'm asking you, please, don't embarrass me. I want to tell you that something broke open in me when he said that. I want to tell you I felt a fury rise up, the kind that makes a man say the things that have needed saying for years. But that's not what happened. What happened was quieter than that. I looked at my son, this man I had raised alone in that house in Dayton, whose tuition I had paid by selling his mother's car, whose name was on a mortgage because I had refinanced my own home, whose law practice existed partly because my credit had backed his loan, and I felt something settle inside me. Not collapse. Settle. The way a structure settles when the last support is removed. I nodded. I said, "All right." He looked relieved. He started to say something about having dinner later in the week. I said, "Enjoy your evening." And I walked to my truck. I sat in the parking lot for a few minutes. Not crying, I hadn't cried since that night in the kitchen with Carol's death still fresh in the house. Just sitting. The cold had gotten into the cab, and I didn't turn the engine on right away. I could hear the faint sound of music from inside the restaurant. My grandson called while I was still sitting there. He'd seen me come in from somewhere across the room. He was whispering, "Grandpa, where are you?" I told him I was in the parking lot. I told him everything was fine. "Dad made you leave," he said. It wasn't a question. I told him his dad had asked me to give them their evening. I told him not to make a thing of it. I told him to go back inside and enjoy the party. and we'd have breakfast in the morning before I drove home. There was a long silence. "I'll come out," he said. I told him not to. I told him it would only make things harder, and that I meant that in every direction. I told him to go be with his family. He said, "You are my family." I sat with that for a moment. "I know," I said. "Go back inside." I drove back to the Holiday Inn, ordered a sandwich from room service, which I rarely do, because it felt like the kind of night that deserved a small indulgence. Ate it watching a college football game I had no stake in. Slept poorly. My grandson met me for breakfast at 7 in the morning. He came in looking like he hadn't slept either. We ordered eggs and didn't talk about the party for the first 20 minutes. Just talked about his classes, the engineering program he was doing well in, a girl he'd met who he was being careful about describing to me. I let him be careful. Then he said, "How long has this been happening?" I told him it had been building for a while. "Did you know she told Dad not to invite you to their 4th of July thing 2 years ago?" I hadn't known that specifically. I'd known I wasn't there. "She tells him things," my grandson said, "about how you make her feel uncomfortable, about how you don't fit with the life they're building." He stopped and looked at his plate. He believes her, or he decides to believe her. I asked him how he felt about it. He looked up at me. He was 19 and already carrying something heavier than he should have been. "I'm angry," he said. "I'm really angry, and I don't know what to do with that because I live in their house and I need them." And he stopped again. I told him that was an honest thing to say, and I was glad he said it. We sat there for another hour. I paid the check. We hugged in the parking lot. He held on longer than usual. I drove the 4.5 hours back to Dayton thinking about what my grandson had said. And more than that, thinking about what I had built over the last 40 years and what I had allowed it to become. When I got home, I sat at the kitchen table, Carol's kitchen table, the same one my son had sat across from me at when he was 11 years old and the world had just ended. And I got out a legal pad and a pen, and I wrote some things down. Not a list of grievances, not a manifesto, just numbers, just facts, the $60,000 down payment, the loan co-signature, the years of tuition, the car I'd sold, the retirement contributions I'd delayed because there was always something they needed. I wasn't keeping score, but I needed to see it written down. Then I made 2 phone calls. The first was to my lawyer, a man named Garrett who'd handled my father's estate and later my own affairs for 20 years. I told him I wanted to review my will and my financial arrangements. I told him specifically about the co-signature on my son's business loan and the equity loan still attached to my property that had funded their down payment. I asked him what my options were. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Are we talking about adjusting or about restructuring?" I said, "Tell me everything." The second call was to my accountant. Different conversation, same general direction. The meetings happened over the next few weeks. I won't walk through all the legal details because they're not the point, but the point is this. I had more leverage than I'd allowed myself to acknowledge. The business loan co-signature could be renegotiated. My will, which had left the bulk of my estate to my son, could be changed. It could be changed to leave the majority of my assets, the Dayton property, my retirement accounts, Carol's small life insurance policy that I'd never touched directly to my grandson, not through my son, directly. I also called the bank about the equity loan. There were options there too, depending on what I wanted to do next. I want to be clear about something. I did not do any of this out of anger. Anger is a fire that burns the person carrying it as much as anyone else. And I had watched enough men my age destroy themselves with it to know better. I did it because I had spent 40 years being the kind of man who kept quiet and moved on and smoothed things over, and I had confused that with love. It wasn't love. It was just quiet. And quiet, I had finally understood, is not the same as okay. I called my son 3 weeks after the anniversary party, not to discuss any of what I'd done that wasn't a phone call conversation. I called to see how he was. We talked for 20 minutes about ordinary things. He mentioned that the party had gone well. I said I was glad. Neither of us mentioned the parking lot. Before I hung up, he said, "We should do that dinner, the 3 of us." I said, That would be nice. We never scheduled it. My grandson came to Dayton for Thanksgiving. He told his parents he was going to a friend's family gathering, which wasn't entirely a lie. I was family, and my house was a gathering, even if it was just the two of us at the kitchen table with a turkey I'd slightly overcooked and a pie I'd bought from the bakery 3 blocks over. We talked for 6 hours, about his future, about my past, about Carol, whom he only half remembered but had been asking about more as he got older. I showed him photographs. He asked questions I'd never been asked before. He asked me once, near the end of the evening, if I was okay. I told him I was better than okay. I told him I had made some decisions recently that had clarified things considerably. He didn't ask me to explain. He just nodded, the way he did sometimes when he was absorbing something. He had Carol's way of listening, fully present, not waiting for you to finish so he could talk, actually listening. I told him then, carefully and simply, that I had updated my will, that I had made him the primary beneficiary, that I wanted him to understand this not as a weapon pointed at his parents, but as a reflection of where my relationship actually was and where it wasn't. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You didn't have to tell me that." I said, "I know. I wanted you to know anyway." He said, "Dad's going to be upset when he finds out." I said, "He might be. Will you be okay with that?" I told him I'd been okay with things for a long time that weren't okay, and that I was learning the difference. He helped me clear the dishes and we watched football until he fell asleep on the couch, and I sat in the chair across from him in the dark and felt, for the first time in years, something like peace. My son found out about the will in February. I don't know exactly how. I suspect my grandson said something, or perhaps Garrett's office sent correspondence that my son happened to see. However it happened, my son called me on a Wednesday morning with a different voice than I was used to hearing from him, controlled but thinner underneath. He asked me if it was true. I told him it was. He asked me why. I said I thought he knew why. There was a silence that went on long enough that I thought he might have hung up. Then he said, "The parking lot wasn't. I didn't mean for it to come out like that." I told him it had come out exactly like it meant to. "She had a lot of anxiety about the evening," he said. "Her parents were there. The senior partners. I was trying to manage a lot of things at once." I asked him if he remembered what he had said to me. The exact words. Another silence. "I'm sorry," he said. "I am genuinely sorry." I told him I appreciated that. I told him I meant it. "Is there anything?" he started, and then stopped, and then started again differently. "Dad, I want to fix this." I told him that was a good thing to want. I told him that I was open to building something real, but that I was done building things that only existed when they were convenient. I told him that I had spent a long time making myself smaller so that the people around me could feel bigger, and that I was not going to do that anymore. Not because I was angry, because I was 64 years old, and I had a limited number of years left, and I intended to spend them being treated the way I had always treated the people I loved. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I think I've been a coward." I told him that was probably accurate. He made a sound that might have been a short, hard laugh. "Is that supposed to make me feel better?" I told him it wasn't supposed to make him feel anything in particular. It was just the truth, and I thought we were probably overdue for some of that. We talked for another 30 minutes. It was not a comfortable conversation, but it was an honest one, and those are not always the same thing. When we hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a while and thought about what it would look like if my son actually meant what he'd said, what it would take, what I was willing to offer, and what I wasn't. I didn't change the will back. That wasn't on the table, but I did call him the following Sunday, and the Sunday after that. Small conversations, careful ones, the kind you have when you're learning to trust something again after the structure has failed. He started calling me on Thursdays. He didn't mention his wife much, and I didn't ask. My daughter-in-law sent me a card in March, handwritten, which surprised me. It said she was sorry for the way things had become, and that she hoped I'd be willing to have dinner with them sometime. The handwriting was careful, and even, the way it would be if you'd drafted it several times. I read it twice, put it in the kitchen drawer, and thought about it for a week. I called my son and said I'd come for Easter. I want to tell you that I arrived at their house that Sunday and everything was different. That my daughter-in-law greeted me at the door like family and my son stood behind her with the weight gone from his shoulders and my grandson was sitting at the table grinning. And some of that was true. My grandson was grinning. My son did look different, lighter, somehow, around the eyes. My daughter-in-law opened the door and said, "Harold, we're glad you're here." It was not warm, exactly, but it was sincere, in the way that effort can be sincere even when it doesn't come naturally. I appreciated it for what it was. We had dinner. My son told a story about a case he'd won that he'd been too self-conscious to tell me before, back when there was always that strange competitive silence between us. I laughed at the right parts. My daughter-in-law asked me questions, real ones, not performance, about my work, about the house, about what I was doing with my time since I'd semi-retired. After dinner, my grandson and I sat on the back porch with coffee while the other two cleaned up. The evening was cold, but neither of us mentioned it. He said, "Is this going to hold?" I told him I didn't know. I told him I thought it depended on whether his father was willing to do something harder than apologizing, actually change what he was willing to tolerate. From his wife and from himself. Do you think he can? I looked at my coffee cup for a moment. "He's my son," I said. "I raised him. The material is there." I paused. Whether he uses it is up to him. My grandson was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He told me what you said to him, about spending your years being treated the way you treat other people." I told him I hadn't meant to lecture. "He needed to hear it," my grandson said. "I think he's been waiting to hear it for a long time." We sat there until the cold got serious. My grandson went inside. I stayed on the porch another few minutes alone, looking out at the yard that backed up against the neighbor's fence. The same kind of yard I'd had in Dayton when my son was small, ordinary, a little overgrown in the corners, the kind of yard a life actually happens in. I thought about Carol. I thought about the table in the kitchen where my son had sat across from me on the worst day of both our lives. I thought about the years between then and now, the wire I'd run and the bills I'd paid and the small version of myself I'd made to fit into rooms that hadn't been built for me. I had not made a scene. I had not raised my voice. I had not said, in the parking lot in November, any of the 10,000 things that had been sitting in my chest for years. I had turned around and walked to my truck and I had driven to a Holiday Inn, and I had eaten a room service sandwich and I had watched football. And then quietly, in the weeks that followed, I had done the things that needed doing. There's a version of this story where I tell you that I came out ahead, that the will change and the financial restructuring and the honest conversations added up to some kind of victory. But that's not quite the right word for what I feel. It's not victory. It's more like weight that's been set down. More like a room that's been cleared of furniture that was always in the wrong place. My son calls me on Thursdays. My grandson sends me texts with photographs of things he thinks I'll find interesting. Engines. Mostly. Construction projects. Once a photograph of an old Dayton neighborhood he'd seen in a documentary. My daughter-in-law and I are not close. We may never be close. But she looks at me now like a person instead of a problem, and that is enough for the moment. I will be 65 in September. My grandson says he wants to come down to Dayton and take me somewhere for dinner. Somewhere I choose. He said, somewhere that doesn't charge $40 for a glass of wine. I told him we'd go to the place on 5th Street that had been there since 1987. Good steaks, cash only, photographs of Dayton sports teams on the wall, going back to decades before either of us was born. He said that sounded exactly right. I think it does too. There is something I want to say before I stop. To anyone out there who has been moving on and smoothing things over and making yourself smaller because you thought that was what love required, it isn't. Love can be quiet and still be honest. Love can be patient and still have limits. Love can be the kind of thing you give freely and completely, without being the kind of thing that costs you yourself. I know this because I am an electrician. I have spent my life working with power, learning what it can do when it's channeled correctly and what it does when it isn't. A circuit with no protection will carry current until it burns. That's not strength. That's just the absence of a boundary. I am not a man who makes scenes, but I am a man who finally learned the difference between quiet dignity and quiet erasure. It turns out they don't look alike at all.